everybody. My name is Conor McCarthy, and I teach in the English department at Maynooth University, which is, for those of you who maybe are outside of Ireland and don't know our geography, Maynooth is just west of Dublin in County Kildare. And you're all very welcome to this event, which is the last in a cycle of Irish Studies seminars and discussions organized in the Department of English at Maynooth University by my colleague, Professor Emer Nolan. I'd like to thank Professor Nolan for her help and her guidance in arranging this talk and discussion. And I'd also like to thank very much Tracy O'Flaherty for her wonderful work with the tech side of things. I'm about as untechy a person as could be imagined. And Tracy's also done wonderful work in promoting the event. And lastly, I'd like to thank the support and backup of my head of department, Professor Lauren Arrington, under whose aegis the event takes place in the first place. About 30 years ago, which is a number which embarrasses me, I was a starting DPhil research student at the University of Sussex. I was already an admirer and a reader of Edward Said, and his work would only become more important for me over the years. But at this time, the available literature on Said was still quite small. And because of that, I was very excited when one day I ran into a volume of essays edited by Michael Sprinker, the late Michael Sprinker, called Edward Said, A Critical Reader. In this volume, in this volume, I found essays by writers with whom I was already familiar, like Benita Parry, but I also found an essay entitled Places of Mind, Occupied Lands, Edward Said and Philology. This essay was by Timothy Brennan. The essay has stayed with me ever since. I liked the essay because it was such a nuanced reading of Said and Said's body of work. This was not someone who was chiding Said for being insufficiently Derridian or too weakly Marxist. This was a writer who could take the full measure of all of Said's influences and inheritances and show his efforts to reconcile them, from Vico to Foucault and from Leo Spitzer to Claude Lévi-Strauss. Over the years, I've gone on reading Professor Timothy Brennan, particularly but not exclusively about Said. Now professor of comparative literature, cultural studies and English at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Professor Brennan has a prodigious range of interests, with books to his name on Salman Rushdie, on cosmopolitanism, on music, and on America's Theory Wars, a particularly joyously confrontational book entitled Wars of Position. More recently, Professor Brennan has been working on a 2-volume project in the history of ideas, Borrowed Light, a history of continental philosophy and its relationship with empire and the colonies. Professor Brennan interrupted his work in this project, 1 volume of which has been published, interrupted his work on this project when the chance came to write a biography of Edward Said. And the resultant splendid book, Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, was published in March. This book offers unprecedented insights into Said's career, into his intellectual trajectories and goals. And as I say, it is the occasion for our gathering today. Professor Brennan is going to talk to us about Edward Said, Jonathan Swift, a writer of the greatest importance for Said and Ireland. He'll address Said's long-running interests in Swift and then move on to perhaps to Said's interests in other Irish writers, coming perhaps up in time to our own present and to the world of the Field Day Collective. Before we actually start, I'd like briefly to refer to someone from that latter milieu, who, though he is not with us in person, I'd like to believe might be with us in spirit. That person is, of course, Seamus Dean, whom we lost only last week. Seamus was a close friend of Edward Said's. He was very much an intellectual in a similar mold to Said. He wrote with great insight about both Swift and Said. And the power and reach of Seamus's oeuvre is something that we in Ireland need to remember, I think, at this moment when new modes of thinking or apparently re-envisioning post-colonial studies or decolonization studies are emerging. Seamus would have been Timothy Brennan's perfect interlocutor, and the world is a lesser and dimmer place without Seamus. Professor Brennan will speak for about 30 minutes, and I will open question for a little while, maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll go to general discussion or general questions. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Conor. It's the only thing that would be better is if I were actually in Ireland speaking to you all. I really feel cheated that COVID has prevented all of that, but I'm really, really grateful for you to have invited me to be here. There's a lot to get through, and I would just ask maybe, Conor, that you would stop me when I've gone on too long, but I'll try to cover what I wanted to say here in those 30 minutes that you referred to. I'm going to be talking about the importance of Jonathan Swift to Said's understanding of language and authorship and the political meaning of Swift for him. These are influences that led to the writing of his most penetrating and, I think, courageous work of critical intelligence, The World, the Text, and the Critic, published in 1983. But I should note at the outset that Said's relationship to the Irish freedom struggle and to Irish thought and letters is hardly defined by an exclusive relationship to Swift. When we imagine his interest in Ireland, we think of the other Irish writers he wrote about, as well as Swift, people that he taught routinely as a modern British specialist in an English department, Yeats, Joyce, and Wilde, particularly, but more peripherally, Beckett. But we shouldn't forget about two intellectuals who are a lot less talked about, but very important for him. The molecular biologist and socialist J.D. Bernal, who was written about in a book that he frequently talked about in the early 1980s, Gary Worski's, The Visible College, and the Irish freedom fighter, Nobel Prize laureate, and UNESCO director Sean McBride. McBride was particularly interesting for him and important for him for having led a tribunal of sorts that analyzed and condemned the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. A kind of note that I would like to strike here, given what's currently happening in Gaza. McBride, at the same time, also wrote, or directed, I should say, conducted a study on the international media called Many Voices, One World in 1981, which really influenced Said a lot in the writing of covering Islam. He really was an important media critic that Said frequently talked about. Similarly, Ireland to him, I think in a general sense, was the country that he would typically invoke alongside South Africa and Israel-Palestine as being proof that colonialism of an older sort still exists. It was for him the symbol of an arrogant minority ruling over a conscious and embattled but resistant majority. Now to Swift. Swift is someone that Edward read as a boy, but as many of us naively do, usually it's Gulliver's Travels. That would, however, have been insignificant had these influences not fallen on more fertile ground in the form of leads that he got from his advisors and mentors. He never completed the Swift book that he had originally conceived of, but the scraps of the arguments, random paragraphs of the texts are skillfully strewn throughout his oeuvre. And the Swift book does in fact appear as a complete book under a different guise, The World, the Text, and the Critic. The project, at any rate, could not have been more central to Said's intellectual designs, long-term aims, or habits of mind. You can't really fathom his intentions without studying his research, both published and unpublished, on Jonathan Swift. His undergraduate guru at Princeton, R.P. Blackmer, had singled out Swift as being, along with T.E. Lawrence, the least abiding writers of magnitude in English, which was his way of suggesting that Swift occupied a privileged place beyond the pale of the grand fragmentary landscape of modernism. Similarly, the long arm of Harry Levin, the co-director of his dissertation at Harvard, a very important figure for Said, is even more readily detected, although here the instructor was the instructed. It's hard to read Levin's short comment on Swift from an essay in 1972 without seeing in it Said's precise game plan as he set out to write this career-making book on Swift. This is what Levin has to say. Swift, quote, who had his own deep vein of subterranean insight, was prophetic when he chose the spider as a prototype of the latest moderns, with their ingenious mechanisms, their cobwebs spun from entrails, and their renunciation of sweetness and light in favor of dirt and poison. We should be deceiving ourselves if we underestimated the anti-humanistic thrust of so much recent writing, end quote. So you see here that Swift, almost from the beginning, through the influence of Levin, is for Said a mark of resistance, both to aspects of literary modernism and to the literary theories themselves heavily influenced by modernism that were in the ascendant at the time he was writing the book. So whether benefiting from the commerce with this protege or only of like mind, Levin joined Said in seeing Swift as a corrector of the Baroque excesses of philosophical modernity. Now, Blackmer's interest in Swift would have stuck with Said also for specific reasons. R.P. Blackmer was this guru, you could say. The professor, he never really took a class with Blackmer, and Blackmer read his undergraduate thesis, but they didn't really know one another. It's just more of an influence that is one that he gets through reading Blackmer. But Blackmer also turns Said, importantly, on to Swift. He had taught Edward that criticism should be more than paraphrase or explanation, that a genius could be found in the best critics, even though it was gnarled and often incomprehensible writing. So he's the one who gives Edward the idea of Tory anarchy, which is the image central to his proposed major study on Swift, and of course is the title of one of the essays that has been published on Swift that's found in The World, the Text, and the Critic. But the connections go much, much deeper in all directions. Blackmer, first of all, gives Edward a kind of style of being a critic that is one that he, in important ways, sees also in Swift. So Blackmer was a delightful misfit in his critical moment. He was an autodidact. He possessed an engaged sense that the critic must interrogate the ethos of the polity, to size it up, to diagnose its ills, uphold rationality, that is, important distinctions and facts, in a society that's either propagandized or overly technologized. It's Blackmer who throws a jaundiced look at the media and situates artists, art, and critics within them. It's Blackmer who moves the question of writing from issues of talent, like one would find in Eliot, to the operative force of the whole social institutions which they willy-nilly represent. That's a quotation from Blackmer in Language as Gesture. Blackmer talks about the economy of literature and about the profit motive. He's opposed to the culture of science. He's intrigued by literary modernism, but doesn't want to be its sucker. He deliberately stood against modernism's irrationality and pervasive darkness. Blackmer recognized the relative philosophical sophistication of Europe as against the United States, wanting to emulate it, but twisting it and calming it down into a kind of down-home or homemade sage quality of American offbeat criticism. Blackmer wrestled with the theoretical problems of language and meaning that so-called theory later did. And he was theoretical, but he wanted to express himself in a non-philosophical manner, in a plain, cajoling, plain-speaking way as a matter of conviction. And only doing so in the course of the critical act, that is, along the way of reading a work of literature. Blackmer really makes an important point that would drive Edward towards Swift in emphasizing how much in literature there is the presence of the hortatory, right? The propagandistic, the ulterior purpose that lies behind the work of the imagination, the didactic, if you will. And so these are some of the things that Edward is picking up in the Blackmer milieu that is very much on his mind when he makes this decision to kind of define his career, to write the truly big theoretical book that's going to make his name on Jonathan Swift. Blackmer believes also in literary value in an absolute sense. That is, the conviction that there are better and worse works of literature, that value is not radically contingent. He's the American F.R. Leavis without the hectoring, the dogmatism, and the cultishness. Finally, Blackmer is an essentially angry liberalism. It's not intolerant, but it's middlish. It's anti-communist and anti-McCarthyite at the same time. He speaks a lot about the new illiteracy, meaning masses who are swayed by newspaper rubbish and the creation of universal education. So these are very much the ideas, I think, that form the early Edward as a critic and that are there in his choice. Now, he had been also introduced to Vico. Of course, Vico is very, very important, and his importance can't be underestimated, as you all know. He'd been introduced to Vico through Arthur Gold, but the Vico that he actually consumed, Arthur Gold was a friend of his, a compatriot and fellow student at Princeton and at Harvard, and that's how he learns about Vico and begins to read him. But I think the Vico that he actually consumes, that is the one that he studies and internalizes, is framed once again by Harry Levin. And this has to do with the Vico who spoke a lot about rhetoric and law as being central aspects of literature, right? So it's the idea here gotten from Vico that political communities bring a certain kind of language into being, right? And the idea that is also found in Vico that that Greek rhetoric was not just a means of persuasion, but it was a substitute for the art of law that was later actually arrived at and realized in Rome. So this connection between politics and language in this particular sense is one that I think also sets up his interest in Jonathan Swift for reasons that we hopefully will be explaining. So now with Swift securely in his sights by means of these mentors, we have to say a word about the other great mentor who he did not study with, but who he knew through his family. And that's Charles Malik, the Lebanese diplomat. Because it's Malik who turns him on to the role of culture in political transformation, the role that culture can play in political transformation. Malik himself is an example of the philosopher as a man of action. And it's Malik who turns Edward on to the idea of beginnings as a difficulty or problem, right? The idea of beginnings is related closely to the notion of imitation. And coming from the Near East, the problem of being a mere mimic man obviously is of overriding importance. So it's Malik who also, in his early essays that Edward undoubtedly read, brings up this notion of a confrontation that occurred in Arab history and letters between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. And this is the debate that takes place between them, between batinia, esotericism, and plainness and openness in literary constructions. So this is something that Edward fixes upon and does a great deal with, and is one of the things that will, be developed or flourish in his writing on Swift. Now, how did the Swift project actually take shape? By the time he makes this decision, he's just completed his dissertation book on Conrad, which is a book that had leaned heavily on the phenomenological and existential ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Now, like the Swift project, this one would be interested in the off genres of authors, right? Not reading their major novels, but reading the other things, the occasional things that they wrote. So in this case of the Conrad book, it has to do with the letters of Conrad, rather than his major novels. But one of the things that preoccupies him in this earlier phenomenological sojourn in the Conrad book is the battle between speaking and writing. And that returns very forcefully in the Swift project. So right before he writes this proposal for the Swift project in 1967, he's attended this conference at Hopkins, a famous, legendary almost conference that launched structuralism in the American Academy. And he saw firsthand there many of the French theorists that he had been busily reading and translating for the New York Times. He was able to see them all there together in person, comparatively. Now, rather than being drawn, though, to the likes of Roland Barthes or Derrida or Jean Hippolyte, all of whom were there, he's drawn in this company to Lucien Goldmann, the one figure at this august gathering of theorists who stands out for him. Goldmann is very much against the stream of most of the people who attended that conference. He's a Romanian who is very francophone and Frenchified. He's a literary sociologist, an acolyte of Georg Lukács, and one of Lukács's principal post-war promoters in Europe. So it's very telling that the two of the very earliest publications of Said, virtually before he had published anything, are reviews of Lukács's Aesthetic and Goldmann's The Hidden God. So he's trying to create his own tradition and wrestle with these constellations. So I don't know how many of you know Goldmann's work, Le Dieu Caché, The Hidden God, but it's a masterpiece all by itself. It's far more interesting than work of French contemporaries like Althusser in Lenin and Philosophy or Deleuze and Guattari at 1,000 Plateaus. It's a profound influence on Said that has gone almost entirely unremarked, even though it was absolutely formative. What kind of book is The Hidden God? First of all, he loves Goldmann for his unique combination of the Gallic tradition of precise observation, Germanic tradition of intuitionism. It's Goldmann that he has, he brings to the fore and says that he's going to base the Swift book on, right? Now, he's looking here very much at a couple of things. The Hidden God is a kind of roman à clef in the sense that it's really setting in the 17th century of Blaise Pascal, the mathematician and philosopher, and the neoclassical Druidian Racine, a series of debates that are standing in for and are really kind of ventriloquizing what is most on his mind, which is alternatives to structuralist linguistics in contemporary France. And so I would posit that what Edward is doing in this work that he imagines of Swift is the same kind of thing, that he has contemporary opponents in mind that he's getting at through the work of Jonathan Swift. So there's this evidence here of the Saidian masks, of this diplomacy, you might say. Hidden subversion would be another way of putting it, in attacking the dominant head on while appearing not to do so. He would later say that literature is to be understood. The term literature is as everything that's written, imagined, or argued. And here he's not going nearly so far. He's much less of a radical. He considers it radical that he is a modern British specialist who's decided to write on an Augustan figure, a figure from the 18th century, Swift. So the first proposal, Swift in History, which outlines that he wants his book to be a sociology of literature, very much like Goldmann, and he invokes Goldmann openly. He doesn't pick Swift purely as a stand-in, though, for his real intentions. He's rather forced to find a way to write about Swift, given his being a perfect illustration of everything he wishes to confront in the relationship of language to politics in his own day. Understood not as a timeless relationship of the two entities, but as a particular problem associated with the declining influence of the intellectual, the rise and stranglehold of the media complex, and the bureaucratic efficiency of a rather savage form of techno-scientific capitalism in the United States. This is why it's a sociology of literature. It's what kind of intellectual is possible, or what kind of intellectual has been produced under this particular situation. And so his attention in the Swift project is very much of that sort. He's trying to understand how shifts in the monarchy, between 1710 and 1714, particularly made Jonathan Swift. So, in as much as the Conrad book prepares him to write the Swift book, it also dovetails with it in important ways. But the problems he means to confront go well beyond partial self-recognition. He looks, first of all, at Swift because Swift represents some things that he thinks of himself as also representing, despite the obvious differences between them. The fact that Swift was very successful at writing a series of polemical pamphlets and political broadsides and propaganda poems in unceasing succession, that according to some historians, Swift's The Conduct of the Allies actually brought peace to Europe. He made the word into an instrument of politics, and not just metaphorically. He single-handedly destroys the Duke of Marlborough, for example. So there's also this notion of the kind of therapeutic act of criticism that he sees in Swift and sees, therefore, also in himself, that being politically and verbally active is one that keeps him out of trouble. It keeps him from thinking morbid thoughts and of being overly harsh towards his enemies. But I think, the problem obviously goes beyond what the self-recognition that he is involved in choosing Swift as his character. The Swift enshrined in Said's undertaking eventually becomes in his own life impatient with figurative language itself. And he sets out on a mission to uphold the clarity of a realism that he found most evident in conversation, a mode of language, after all, that is to the point of the moment, the occasion of direct personal exchange. So the implication of his praise for Swift's style is hard to overstate. The very content of Swift's work, described as suspended in the plain style, or depicts a show of freaks and horrors, a mad hack, an astrologer being murdered, an absurd and impossible war. This is writing under the burdens of the own absurd and impossible wars that Said was experiencing at the time, both in Vietnam, obviously, but also the An-Naqsa, right? The Six-Day War that led to the occupation of Palestinian land in 1967. Said fixes upon a mode of political writing found in Swift's unadorned language, which is meant to situate the writer within his own statements and evade the intellectual game of ambiguity. So this gets back to that thing that I raised a minute ago that you got from Malik, the idea of the Arabic rhetoricians known as Batinists, who were into the esoteric side of scripture, who each articulate a principle in similar terms and for the same reasons. This particular feature of style will have surprising ramifications as well for his reception of Lukács's critique of modernism and the culture and imperialism. But for the moment, the key thing is how Said relates this anti-formal property of Swift's writing to the latter's principal subject, which Said describes as, first, the loss of power, and second, the difficulties of maintaining a decent relationship between words and reality. Swift's impressive mastery for Said of the realistic detail is what excites him, even if it is expressed, given Swift's misanthropy, as scatology and a hatred of the rabble. So this on-the-spot, occasional nature of writing was one that Said fixes on in Swift, right? That's evident in the very title, Some Free Thoughts on the Present State of Affairs, May 1714 would be one of these kinds of titles from Swift's work that would address this. So, just like Gramsci would say later that he wished at one point in his life to write something für ewig, for forever, for all time, sort of classic, above it all. Most of Gramsci's writing, and the writing that matters the most to us, was in direct conversation with an interlocutor, an opponent, if you will, and that Gramsci couldn't even he felt like he couldn't even think clearly unless he had an interlocutor in mind. This is what really Said is praising about Swift's resorting very often to the occasional nature of writing. But Swift was also a chronicler of the tragedy of the literary for Said. He is thinking of he's thinking always about dialogue, right? That something that would counteract the disembodied Gnostic declaration. This is where he is also drawn to Goldman, that this Columbia lecture, his inaugural Swift statement, was called simply Jonathan Swift. It was later called the Coherence of Swift. And he was saying that an oeuvre that for the Swift scholars often seemed disjunct or riven by the before and after of the great satirist's political life at court was hopelessly diffuse in the random genres through which he wrote, anatomy, tract, satire, lampoon, and whose early style was unrecognizable in the late Gulliver's Travels, that all of this apparent randomness was in fact a totality. So coherence is, like I said, one of the titles that he emphasizes in his writing on Swift. It was one of the titles that he tried out as the title for the work that was never actually published. Coherence in Said's lexicon is a word that is meant to stand in for totality. It's a deliberate act of translation. This isn't speculation. He says so more or less openly. He takes the translation perfectly clear from his comments on Goldman's virtuoso performance of The Hidden God in the review of 1966, as well as the book proposal of the same year. I read Swift as a totality, albeit made up of diverse parts, yet very much a unity. Totality, he explains, is a concept like God that allows people to create a working notion of the world out there, to provide a common framework of perception, to see in literary criticism the historical meaning of a writer's life, of the inner coherence of his work, and of the integrity of his vision. The travails of Swift for him, the coherence of his life and thought, is that he gave expression to an historical moment to which he was himself subject, made inert by the material forces that rendered him an object in every sense but his consciousness of that condition. This complete fusion of person, time, event, and circumstance is Swift's totality. Swift, born of English parents, but brought up in Ireland, someone who lived in exile after the fall of the monarchy in an Ireland that he detested, but that he also defended against British imperial outrages. This, along with that phrase from Swift's epitaph that Said can't help from himself from quoting often, of savage indignation, right? The notion of a critic who is angry, where anger is what fuels the insights. These are some of the notions, along with what I've been trying to emphasize here in these quick opening comments, the battle between the written and the spoken, the art of conversation, the occasional, the man of action who is also a philosopher. These, I think, are the major efforts that are involved in his relationship to Swift, and why he wanted Swift, why he felt Swift was the perfect exemplum in all of English literature for exposing the excesses of a literary theory that was apolitical and botanist that was coming to fruition at this moment. So with that, I think I've thrown enough ideas up there. We can maybe now begin to have a conversation.
That was marvelous, Tim. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. You've given me an awful lot to work with there. I suppose one of the things I was interested in, and I think I wrote to you about this just the other day, which was that Said in The World, the Text, and the Critic refers to the crucial place of Swift in that book, which you now have given us, very richly the background to, if you want, in the development of, or the wished for development of a book about Swift, which of course didn't quite happen, but happened, as you've been saying, I think, in this alternative way. I'm wondering, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on the ways that Swift emerges in some of the non-Swift essays in that book. The World, the Text, and the Critic, for people who may be here but who aren't familiar with it, it's an extraordinary and marvelous collection of essays that in particular, I think, are about, if you want, intellectual degeneracy, if you want, or degeneration, the ways that ideas or putatively radical ideas can frequently decline or become institutionalized or become reified, to use a Lukácsian kind of language. So the book contains marvelous essays on the fate of left literary criticism in America, let's say, or on the fate of what Said called traveling theory, the movement of a revolutionary body of doctrine like that of Lukács from Budapest in 1919 to being used in a seminar room in Cambridge or indeed at Columbia in the 1960s or the 1970s. Are there ways in which the Swiftian examples sort of can be seen to underpin some of those essays? I always regard the World, I mean, I won't go on, but I regard the World, the Text, and the Critic, the more I read it and reread it, almost as a kind of manual for insurrection. It's an extraordinary book.
Yeah, it's a book, I think, that unlike his typical, I don't know, moderation, I would say, right? His soft touch, his even evasiveness at times in his prose, when it regards criticizing developments in the profession, right? When things are close to home, he's very, very reluctant to be polemical. He can be polemical, of course, when people attacked him in print, but he for the most part, was not the kind of person to pick fights that way. He's much more frank, even brutal, I would say, in The World, the Text, and the Critic, which is one of the things that I like about it, and perhaps is one of the Swiftian elements in it overall. But see, the thing is that it's hard to get into all of the nuances here because we don't have time, but the relationship of The World, the Text, and the Critic to the Swift project is not just thematic, and it's not just a sense of kind of theoretical orientation or this or that point in common. It's actually, when you read the letters, the correspondence between him and his Harvard University Press editor, that he keeps promising this Swift project. You know, he holds on to it for a very long time. He keeps working on it over and over again. And he keeps telling this person at Harvard University Press, it's coming, don't worry, you know, next year. At a certain point, he says, you know what? I want to turn this into something else because I want to reach a different audience. That's the way he puts it. A series of essays that will be put together that are a critique of criticism itself. That is, it's a critique of developments, intellectual developments within the academy. I mean, he talked about 19th century French and British philologists in Orientalism. He talks about the American media in covering Islam, and now he's turning his attention to home, the university, and what is the university doing or not doing in the age of Reaganism, right? So it's the early 1980s and the beginning of the Great the Restoration, right? So he is very Swiftian in his own mind. That is, the ideas that he's attempting to elaborate in the Swift project all along do find expression even when Swift is not mentioned in a number of the dimensions of The World, the Text, and the Critic, which I think is a way of answering the question that you raised. Think of the essay, for example, that did not make it into The World, the Text, and the Critic, but is really a précis, a kind of microcosm of the entire book and its intention. Right, opponents, audiences, constituencies, and community, which was written at just about the same time. What do you find in that essay? You find an attack on the technocratic smoothness of American inequality, right? The kind of cold and dispassionate, smoothly functioning barbarism of a culture that deifies science and despises or disregards and finds unimportant anything having to do with the humanities. It's a place where the intellectual of the sort that he both represented but also wanted to promote is a second-rate figure in comparison to the media pundits, the brainless, kind of low wattage people who are the spokespersons for the American media. And so this is, in his own mind, analogous to the experience that Swift had as it moved from a moment when he could actually, with his pen, intervene politically in events, that he was a person who had government positions and he had the ear of the people who actually ruled. And so what he wrote actually had direct force. And so when things become more bourgeoisified, as it were, right, in the 18th century in England, and you get this phenomenon of the professional politician, somebody like him is aced out, right? It's now everything becomes bureaucratically predictable. And so I think that notion of a kind of technocratic, smoothly functioning barbarism is something that he sees in America and that he saw also in Swift. And to him, they're very much analogous. That's one thing. There's the notion of specialization versus general intellectual work. I mean, he talks in the opponent's essay of a constantly shrinking fiefdom forbidden to the uninitiated. All right. So what he has in mind there, of course, is the techno jargons of literary theory itself, and the fact that it stopped being a public intellectual work and became this a jargon of accreditation, where people can get jobs in the university. And so he's thinking about that, but he's also thinking about what he confronted in trying to write the Swift book, where the uninitiated is another way of saying he would be taking a huge professional risk to write about Jonathan Swift as a modern British scholar because of the cult of 18th century scholarship, that they would consider him to be outside his scope of authority. And so he's railing against that. This is the kind of avatar, you might say, of that earlier idea, now applied somewhat differently in the opponent's essay, but very, very similar to what was on his mind in writing the Swift thing. The anger, right? The savage indignation is something that he has in mind, right? He emulates that in Swift, and he is unleashing it to a certain point in The World, the Text, and the Critic. The notion of totality, as I was describing it a moment ago, is something that he comes back to, I think, repeatedly in the essays of The World, the Text, and the Critic. Why that's important. That is the general intellectual who is not deterred by being told that he or she should not be talking about economics because they're literature professors. This idea that you can make broad connections, and that really the only way to do so is to be a general intellectual. This is partly what he means by totality, that all is connected, right? That we, in analyzing the language of politics, perhaps, as literary critics, are also saying something about how programmatic decisions have been made and how they are affected and disseminated among the population. So this kind of idea is on his mind, what he called in Swift coherence. And maybe the last thing is that he's really, really concerned about the way that culture, the particular culture of the United States, makes the affiliations between ideas and scholarship on the one hand and brute politics and corporate, rule on the other invisible. It makes that connection invisible. And this is something that Swift, of course, blew out of the water. He made perfectly visible, which is one of the reasons that despite all of the political things that separates him from Swift, is something that he deeply identifies with.
Yeah, Swift wasn't really a man to be contained by humane marginality, I think. one of the things I love about the essay is the sheer sense of the speed at which it appears to be written, or at which it paces itself. He sets up a discussion of guild consciousness or interpretive communities or insights from Vico, and he constantly says, well, I've dealt with that, but I must move on. This sheer sense of pace. I wonder, and one of the things I love about Places of Mind is the way that, just hopping backwards slightly and momentarily away from Swift, the way that you show how when Said first came to Columbia, one of his, if one might rather crudely say that there were two great exemplars at Columbia in front of him, like Trilling and Dupee, Lionel Trilling and Fred Dupee, that it was Dupee who ultimately maybe was chosen as the more, the model that was actually, that he tried to emulate more. And I was very struck by the way that you point out that in some very early essays, Said is writing, albeit maybe about Lukács or some of the other earlier focuses, but he's writing for things like the Partisan Review, or for the Kenyan Review, these journals that aren't yet maybe fully theorized or academicized. And already, very early on in his professorial career, there is this emphasis on trying to reach a wide audience, or even a general audience. Just one last thing, maybe about the opponent's essay. There is a fairly two well-known Anglophone Marxists are given some fairly rough handling in the essay. Both of them, I presume, allies and to some extent friends of Said. Certainly, Jameson. Would you have sympathy with that kind of the model? The difference that he sets up between political philosophy as a kind of academic practice, and then, if you want, left-wing or Marxist literary criticism as being something that ultimately, in spite of its languages or its critical approaches, finds itself talking to itself, if you know.
Very much so. In the case of Jameson, I think, we've all learned a lot from Fred Jameson. I mean, he's in the early essays that he wrote on the philosophy of Hegel, they're absolutely brilliant. And I think he turns Hegelianese into an American idiom to a degree of perfection that I think no one has really, lived up to. I think that it becomes a very different thing later in his career. His writings on Hegel are much less secure, much shakier, I think, more recently. But no, I think that, I think as I've said in an interview, or maybe I've even written about, I'm not sure, but I mean that Edward would talk about Fred as being an ally. He'd never attack him ever in print, and was constantly reaching out to him and seeking him out and hoping that he would help join the cause. But he drew the conclusion that Jameson isn't really political. He's not very interested in being actually involved in causes. He doesn't really believe in them. To him, it's very much an intellectual exercise. And I've had personal conversations with Fred Jameson, and I think about this very issue. And my impression is the same, that his Marxism is 100% textual and not at all applied. But there have been moments when that wasn't only the case, and when he did in fact speak out. I think after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, there are exceptions to that. But I agree with the drift and gist of Edward's reservations with aspects of academic Marxism as he presents them in that essay. The problem, I think, with Edward when it comes to this being critical of Marxism, I mean, apart from the infamous things that he had said in Orientalism, comparing Marx to the likes of Matthew Arnold and people like that, which I think we have a right to be upset about, is that particularly in Culture and Imperialism, he doesn't ever really give the kind of attention that he should, or the props that he should, to Third International Marxism and all of the figures within it who created, I think it's fair to say, the first truly anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, and not just for narrow, short-term political gain. The culture of imperialism was theorized to an extraordinary degree. There are novels and poems and obviously a lot of great organizational work that was put behind it. So that it's kind of the theorization of everything that Edward loved about the anti-colonial liberation movements of Césaire and Fanon and others obviously are the product of that Third International Marxism. I mean, he never would make that connection. He was very reluctant to do that, and I think that's a failing in Edward.
just leaping forward again, and I'll maybe make this my last question before maybe opening things up to everyone else. I was very taken with the way that you write about some of Edward's late, to use maybe a slipshod formulation, journalism about Palestine, and in particular. And you put in the word journalism in the scare quotes a little bit, because I think that you raise particularly the work in the volume, The End of the Peace Process, which is of course a collection of essays written over a period of years from the middle to the late 1990s, after Oslo. You really raise the importance of that work and of that volume. And I wonder, if one would one detect again the trace of Swift's agitationalism, of his occasionalism, of his sense of writing or work as something that is almost a set of events in some of that work about the already collapsing Oslo process, which Edward obviously was skeptical about from the very start.
You know, I think really the answer is implicit in your wonderful question, which really is more of a comment, and I think it's a brilliant observation on your part. Yeah, the generic plenitude of the actual written works of Jonathan Swift, this desire, given the occasion and what was appropriate to the occasion, the conjuncture, we might say, right? To use one genre versus another in order to get things across to readers, to explain, to plainly state, to oppose, also to hide a little bit, right? One's own identity. All of this is sort of implicit in Edward's writing about Swift. All of that can be seen, in fact, in the generic mixedness of these essays by Said in this outpouring that took place towards the end of his life, in the last decade of his life, where he wants to address Arab audiences directly in an ongoing way. And so he has a column in 3 different Arab publications that fill those volumes. But he's mixing things up. He writes music reviews. He has autobiographical essays. He writes short little biographical vignettes about people. So the length of them are different. The tone in each one of these essays is different. I guess one of the reasons I was so excited about it and said such wonderful things about it is because I had previously been ignorant of that. Like many people, I suppose, we thought, well, I know what Edward thinks about Palestine. I don't need to read it all, Yes. But if you sit down and you read that volume, from beginning to end, you just are struck not only by the fertility of his ideas. That is, he's constantly coming back to issues that he needs to attack from a new angle and express in new language. There's almost no self-quotation. He doesn't recycle things. Even though he's been over these things 100 times, he finds a new way to say it in a new genre. So there's just the doggedness, the bloody mindedness of the energy that it must have taken to do that is impressive. But it's also, it's poetic. It's versatile. It's alive. It's some of his best writing. It's quite astounding. So I really urge those of you who have not read all of these essays to go into them and treat yourself to them, because it shows a dimension of Edward that when I began the project I simply didn't know existed.
Yeah, likewise, I wouldn't even have taken that work properly seriously. I would have said, okay, yes, I read that essay in the LRB, or I saw that in The Nation. That was grand. And then I sort of forgot about it and moved on, frequently because the situation in Palestine appeared to be, mostly in bad ways, moving on. But I haven't really given that kind of work the attention that it deserves. So we might go and invite questions. I think maybe the best way is for us to use the chat function in Zoom. And I think I'm just going to click on the chat and open the sidebar here. There are a couple of questions here already, but I'd invite anyone else to put in questions. And I'll just read the questions to Tim, if that's okay. Tim, there's a question from Ronit Lenton, whom you remember wrote or co-wrote a pioneering translation into Hebrew of The Question of Palestine. another book of Edwards, which I think in some ways gets frequently neglected by the people. Ronit is writing. Forgive me, Ronit is just saying how great it is to listen to you. But Ronit, if you want to add a talk, please go right ahead. My 18th century colleague and dear comrade and friend, Conrad Brunstrom, is asking, what, Tim, might you think are the implications for Said of Swift's repeated attacks on the hubris of so-called progress and the enabling effect of a version of progress for imperialist self-justification?
He eventually gives up the Swift project for the reasons that I've already spelled out. However, he does say, and I think this is in the book, so maybe some of you already know what I'm about to say, but he also says that the misanthropy of Swift, the penetrating darkness of his vision of a non-existent human progress dovetails in Edwards' mind with his career, which was mostly in fawning service to aristocrats, So I think that he of course, as you'd expect, cannot identify with the politics of Jonathan Swift, which is related to his notion, as many people on the political right do also derive their politics from a dismal, dark view of human nature. So would Said have given any quarter to the notion that the hubris of progress is itself the kind of inner spirit of imperialism? And I would say no. I think that he would disagree very emphatically with Swift on this point. For Said, as you know from reading Culture and Imperialism, he believes that imperialism is not what most of us anyway, think of imperialism as being, which is a later kind of financialization of colonialism and the streamlining of it, in unequal systems of trade established by the World Bank and those kinds of entities, backed up, of course, by military violence. But he sees it rather as preceding colonialism and as being a kind of a lust or urge to conquer others, to have superiority over others, right? Which he would consider to be regressive, that is, a return of some sorts to barbarism. Not, in other words, a sign of the hubris of progress. I think he would be somebody who might identify with the notion that the claims to progress have been hubristic, that the real progress isn't really often what people claim it to be. But he would be one who would ardently believe in the possibility of it and the necessity of trying. So I think that this, Edward, I've said this in a number of different venues, but I'll say it again, that, Edward is perverse in his loves and his desires when it comes to intellectuals and literary figures. He's always drawn to the people that are most unlike him and that he would most dislike if he were, face to face with them. And that's really true of Swift in spades. This doesn't mean that he ever wants to walk away from such a figure. He wants to learn from them. That's typically his way of doing things. And I think that this was a pattern or a model that was really drilled into him in his childhood relationship with Charles Malik, who's a right-wing racist Lebanese anti-communist that was related to his family. So this kind of relationship is established very, very early with him, and I think that's the relationship that he has with Swift as well. But he's absolutely impeccably correct, it seems to me, when he sizes up the political outlook of Jonathan Swift, right? That in other words, he's able to project himself into Swift well enough to be able to make a persuasive argument for Swift's political vision, right? Which is to say that everything is anarchy unless the stable pillars, as it were, right, of a society are respected and bowed to, right, which is the Church of England, obviously, and the monarchy. And so, when you look at it from that point of view, you can kind of understand why Swift drew the conclusions he did. They're entirely antipathetic conclusions, however, to Edward's whole modus operandi.
It's interesting how, you could say that he was drawn to Swift. He was drawn to Conrad, not exactly certainly not a liberal or a progressive or a radical. And he makes Edward makes interesting and in some ways slightly peculiar uses, let's say, of like Julien Benda, or Bonda, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, in his his book about the treason of the intellectuals, and it's as if, maybe is it too crude to say that these not left-wing writers are a foil, or is this something in there? Probably a simpler way to put it, or monotone way to put it.
Well, Edward was too systematic in his apprenticeship with certain figures who had succeeded, like Swift had succeeded, in developing a language that had wide accessibility. He was too much involved in that kind of strategic thinking about how I reach as many people as I possibly can, for us to dismiss out of hand that there was a merely utilitarian purpose behind his perversity, right, in choosing people that would throw people off. A little bit like the way that Slavoj Žižek puts people, off balance by writing in one book about Lenin and in the other about Lacan as a Hegelian thinker. You know what I mean? It's like you're able to enter the sphere of high theory, as it were, by saying I'm a Lacanian, and really showing that you've completely mastered that system of Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he does. And I would say that maybe there is something to that. The explosive message that Said was trying to impart to people was aided by his unpredictability in choosing people that were deeply conservative, who were themselves imperialistic, who were Catholic, apolitical demagogues like Benda, right? It is possible that is a big dimension of why he's drawn to them. But I prefer to think of it otherwise. I prefer to think of it more in this this wonderful Hegelian sense. Of course, Edward hated Hegel, and he was not at all a Hegelian, but this sense of, having something to learn from almost anybody, right? And the people who he's drawn to are all like him in some ways. They just aren't people who believe in what he believes in. He's choosing something different. So he's also drawn to them for those reasons. But I think that there's something more about the psychological complexity of Edward Said, the fact that a lot of what he wrote and how he wrote it had to do with hiding himself, and had to do with a kind of therapy. The constant drive certainly had to do with a deep dissatisfaction in himself and a complete insecurity about himself. That certainly is true. But I think it's also true that that we are, in many of our desires, perverse. This is something that psychoanalysis, I think, has taught us, and one must agree with. And I think that's also there.
I think that's particularly obvious in the Conor piece.
Yeah.
Conrad's extraordinary stuff, levels of self-torture and agony and crises of confidence. I'd like to go to a question in the chat from David Lloyd. And David writes, though Said could be caustic in person and in public speech, I'm not sure he ever emulated Swiftian satiric savage indignation, but there may be things I don't know. Certainly savage indignation and satiric invective seem right now the only language adequate to what's going on in Palestine. If any thoughts as to why a man as intellectually and affectively passionate as Said did not make a practice of satiric essay writing?
It's a great question.
Why was Edward not a satirist? Malik's book on
I think I think that's more than anything a question of two things. One of them has to do with personality and disposition. The other one would have to do with literary gifts. The Edward Said that I knew, and I think the one that I try to write about, is one who believed very, very strongly, and this is where he departs from Foucault, that one chooses one's own traditions, right? That part of what it means to be an intellectual is to actively affiliate with a constellation. And that constellation of thinkers could be very, filled with people who are very unlike one another, but it's sort of like for different reasons. They have inspired you, or they've laid the groundwork for what you want to develop, or something along those lines. And I think that when you think about the constellation overall that he had chosen for himself, right, which involves Vico and Gramsci and Lukács, as well as Swift, that the satirical impulse, if he were in fact literarily talented enough to pull that off, right, which is a whole other question. But that way of making one's political points would undercut the heart and soul, I think, of this constellation, which is appealing to the public in a different way. And that is a kind of a high-minded ingenuousness and a kind of a lofty moralism, if I could put it that way. I mean, when he writes about Benda, you're thinking, like, is he having us on? Who could be a worse example of someone to write about the intellectual than Benda, who thought that any participation in politics was a violation of the avocation of the intellectual. But Edward is completely sincere in his embrace of Benda in one sense, and that Benda really believes in the high-mindedness and moral mission of the intellectual. To buy into and to project that afflatus, right, is one that would be, I think, destroyed by the satiric impulse. Said doesn't want to even, doesn't want to give even very much leeway to or props to irony. He really thinks that plain speaking is its own art and its own beauty. And I saw him put that into practice again and again. I mean, when you read, I thought at the time in the early 80s when I was reading The World, the Text, and the Critic that these essays were very straightforward. You go back to them now or try to teach them to your students, and they're quite, subtle and rather difficult to read the contexts and the space between the lines of. But as he moved forward, he became simpler and simpler, more and more direct, more and more entertaining. I just think that it kind of violates his ethical code to participate in a literary genre whose very essence is contempt. It's about contempt. And it's also about, contempt for your reader. Up to a certain
maybe contempt is something that is quite easily felt, but critique is maybe something harder to produce. And again, I'm not any kind of expert on satire or on Swift. I suppose there's also the problem, though, that isn't satire, and this is a very elementary thing to say about satire, satire is parasitic on that which it tries to debunk or to criticize. So there's always the worry of possibly in some way inadvertently reinforcing a discourse that you're seeking to, in another moment to undermine.
Well, there must have been a great deal of enjoyment, however, that he derived from the satirical attacks of Jonathan Swift that he was reading. I think, that they were effective was amazing. That he wrote them anonymously was telling. That he actually did, in fact, bring down important leaders by virtue of what he wrote was impressive. All of these things are positives as as Edward would be a reader of and follower to a certain extent of Jonathan Swift. But to choose it for oneself involves a completely different calculation, right? Again, quite a part of one's ability to do it. It would violate, it seems to me, the overall spirit, if I can use such a term, of his constellation.
Okay, Joe Cleary is asking, where in Middle Eastern political or intellectual life or in Anglophone cultural criticism is Said's influence now most generative? What from the work has proved most cutting since his death? And Joe, I'm not quite sure if I followed this correctly. There's an addition to Joe's question referring to, in regard to satire, Joe is thinking of Emil Habibi and the Pessimist as an exemplar of Palestinian literature.
Right, and so just to begin at the end, I mean, Edward, of course, praises that wonderful comic satirical novel, The Ill-Fated Pess-Optimist, in an essay that is a very early essay and a very, I think, not as widely read an essay of Edward's that is a very important essay on Arab writing after 1948. But keep in mind that at the same time that he is lauding the variety and generic mixedness of Arab writing in order to show its fertility, he spends a lot of time talking about the rather more didactic Brechtian maneuvers of people like Sadiq al-Azam and others. So, you know, he isn't only embracing Habibi. He's also talking about a very different kind of art and praising that as well. In fact, maybe even focusing more on that in that particular essay, which is, I think, very interesting. Just like I was very interested that he was one of the outside readers of the dissertation by Hanan Ashrawi, which is all about the didactical force of the new aesthetic created in Palestinian writing. And the committee, we've all had this kind of situation, we who are professors, where you've got to sort of calm down the people who are outraged by the argument of the dissertation on the committee. He had to play that role to say, no, she's right, you know. And so this is a side of Edward you wouldn't really think existed, but it's there in the record. That he's more of a Brechtian maybe in his attitudes towards literature and in his critique of modernism than one would have expected. But back to the nature of the question, I think that I'd say two things. I mean, one of them is that very clearly some of the interest in this biography that I've written clearly has to do with the felt need for the voice of an Edward Said, that we need somebody like him today to counter the outrages going on right now in the occupied territories. And the ones that preceded it in the Trump administration, where Jerusalem was now officially recognized as Israel's capital, and talk of outright annexation of all Palestinian lands became kind of, ho-hum. So this is the example, in other words, of a critic who is not part of a political party, who is an intellectual with, how could we put it, inoffensive scholarly credentials, right? He's a literature professor. That is, he believes in high-mindedness and high culture, this kind of figure who can come forth and speak not just the truth. It's not just that he's amassing all of the persuasive facts and figures and details, but is himself performing a personality that can engage people, make people want to be around him or like him. That the whole package, the performative package of Edward in the world, is missed deeply. So in terms of like his influence and his legacy, that would certainly be one of them. But as I try to argue in this book of mine, I really think to answer Joe's question more directly, I think his biggest legacy has to do with the humanities and making the humanities dangerous in the best sense of the word, right? Bringing the humanistic enterprise of inquiry to the center of political life, making people understand the stakes of what we talk about in the humanities and its close, intimate relationship to the creation of policy and the formation of publics and the creation of new agendas or imagining of different worlds other than this bad reality, that we live in. I think that he really articulated that and showed it to be effective. And that to me is his most important legacy. And if the more people get that, get a sense of that, it seems to me that will be his ongoing influence.
I like that you highlight that in your book. I started reading, not to be boring, I'm just about myself, but I started to read Edward as an undergraduate when I was an undergraduate. And then I had a wonderful MA year in UCD where I read Orientalism and the World, the Text and the Critic in classes with Seamus Dean and with Declan Kuiper and with Bloomsbury. And this was the summer, this was the calendar year in 1991. So it was also the time of the, what we in the West call the first Gulf War, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and then the war to throw Iraq out of Kuwait. I was reading outside of the classroom, I was reading Coburn and Hitchens for the first time, and I was being very excited by radical journalism. And I stopped being boring about myself, but what I got from those classes, both from Seamus and Declan and Thomas, and also from Edward's books and reading them with these exemplary teachers, was this extraordinary excitement of there being major stakes involved in the study of literature and in the critique of humanistic culture. That was enormously exciting. I mean, to sound a bit like the fan that in many ways I am, of course, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, even though maybe it's abject and childish to say it. Reading Edward Said was for me certainly a completely major influence on my wish to go on to graduate school. Because I had not read a critic who had made these things seem so important and so worthwhile. As I say, I really love it that in the biography you stress that, as you've just stressed it in conversation here now. I think it's incredibly important. I was just thinking of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. I was, and again, in looking over notes and in looking over the biography just in the last couple of days, there's a passage, I can't remember offhand where it is, where you quote Edward saying that, and then again, I think this is a point with a kind of Swiftian subcurrent in it, maybe, that and Edward would not have been the only person to have said this, but that something bad is about to happen when a politician or a media expert talks to you about how complex this situation is. The situation in Gaza is, of course, extremely complex, and for that reason, we are apparently limited in the kinds of intellectual or political judgments that we can make of it. But of course, in fact, actually the situation is not that complex at all, as I need to tell you. And I think that's yet another point that Edward, I think if he was here, that he might be making now, that remains essential for us all, whether it's in Middle Eastern politics or in politics or other spheres. Would anyone like to offer us any further questions? We could hop backwards just briefly maybe to an addendum to David Lloyd's question, where David has written, satire is Tory anarchy. Can we reflect on that, or is there something is there more to make of that?
Right. It's a difficult phrase to parse, isn't it? I mean, he gets it, as I said, from Blackmer, and he does something with it that might or might not have expressed what Blackmer was talking about. But anarchy would, in this particular way of thinking about it, be associated with a right-wing philosophy rather than the top-down authoritarian kind of thing that one would associate with a monarchist, right? One who supports authority in the singular figure of the monarch. So it seems to be, an oxymoron in some ways, this notion, right? But not the way that Edward writes about it. Edward is primarily drawn to the phrase, I would say, because of wanting to argue, and this would be one of his major contributions to Swift studies, as he saw it at the time, that despite the fact that the author of A Tale of the Tub at the beginning of his career, who writes with an exuberance that's unleashed and in a completely chaotic kind of creativity, and Gulliver's Travels, which is restrained and finely polished and neatly structured towards the end of his career, that there's this great transformation, according to most scholars of Swift, between the man who wrote the earlier and the former. So much so that, as Edward would often comment, Swift, as an older man, looked back at A Tale of the Tub and wondered, how he could have written it. Who was that person, in fact, who wrote it? But Edward wants to talk about the coherence of these two. So the relationship between the anarchic spirit that wrote the first book and the more controlled, plain style kind of figure who wrote the latter, and wants to find what is continuous between them, how the one led to the other, how the latter is contained in the former, and so on. So that's really his idea here. I think that the way I chose to interpret it, the way I finally parsed it, was to say that when you want to free yourself from all rules anarchically, that what tends to happen is a constriction rather than openings. And therefore, the conclusion to draw in this image of Tory anarchy is that an artificially imposed discipline is what allows for a fruitful creativity, for the breaking through of impasses and the seeing things in a new way, and writing something of true value. And I think that is the way that you can kind of square the circle in this image and how Edward did.
I'm just wondering if you'd like to say a few words about Edward's evident, not only personal friendship with, but also, I think, and you've already referred to it, if only briefly, his interest in and sympathy for the Field Day project, of which Jameson was obviously one of the chief leaders. One of the things I would always want to say about Seamus, and it applies, of course, to Edward as well, is that Seamus was not just an academic professional, he was an intellectual, or as you guys in America will insist on calling him, a public intellectual. And that is that, Seamus took the task of thinking conceptually about the world in public very, very seriously. Not humorously, but seriously, if you know what I mean. They're obviously not the same thing. And you'll know, obviously, that Field Day was and is a multifarious project with anthologies and plays and pamphlets as well. And obviously, Edward was a contributor of a Field Day pamphlet, or the author of a Field Day pamphlet. Would you like to speak a little bit about that connection?
Yeah, I think, he invokes the Field Day directly, of course, in one of the reissuings of Orientalism. So he writes an introduction in which, towards the end, he invokes Field Day. And of course, there are many things that are attractive to him in this, and that sort of match things that he attempted to accomplish himself in his own organizational activities, which is the idea, first of all, of course, that it's not just an individual writing a work of public accessibility, but it's a collective. It's an example of intellectuals with varying talents and different ways of approaching things generically and literarily, who have created an affiliation, who have a common cause that is open-ended, that doesn't, subscribe to fixed principles. It's more of a kind of a general orientation that brings them together, right? In which each one of their individualities is not lost. It's able to express itself, but now amplified by its association with other people. So I think this is one thing that is very, very strongly attractive to him in the Field Day project. I think that's also, the notion of what is and what is not a national movement, right? And I think so. There's always this difficulty in Edwards thinking about himself and his own politics, about the distinction between one like himself who worked very hard at creating a nation state for a dispossessed people, and the quite different thing, which is nationalism. So a lot of his writings on Yeats, kind of explore this rather tricky relationship that Yeats had to the Irish freedom struggle, that he is identified strongly with it in the sense that Yeats, that is, went back like others before him to, build a mythology out of being Irish. The Irish essence is expressed through mythological figures and a return to the Irish language and those kinds of gestures, right? Which I think Edward found salutary, but also a little dangerous in some forms of their expression. So he's constantly sort of, I wouldn't say excusing Yeats's fascistic tendencies. He doesn't do that. He brings it up, but he brings it up in a kind of dialectical way, which is to say that there are these dimensions to what Yeats was attempting to do that we have to identify with a liberatory impulse that could only express itself in an actual political entity, not just a series of poems about Cuchulainn or whatever, right? It's more specific than that. So I think that he's seeing, obviously, as you point out yourself, it's a Republican movement, not a monarchist one, that is going on in the Field Day, that they're on the left, and yet they are exemplars of the active role of literature, right? And literary intellectuals writing essays, the active role of that kind of activity and national consciousness and national formation, that the political objectives are kind of organic to the undertaking. And that is precisely what he attempted himself to do in his own writing, and how he saw the role of the intellectual.
I was very struck again in places of mind to the way that you refer to something that I had not really known of Said thinking about towards the end of his life, this idea of the collective intellectual, where I think he invokes himself and Chomsky and Pierre Bourdieu as loosely affiliated allies, but allies nevertheless, because of course Edward was very fond of saying that he wasn't a party joiner. Again, I think one of the wonderful things about your biography is that it reveals the enormous amount of organizational and networking activity that he was doing. I'd say probably throughout most of his career, or certainly in large swatches of it. Letter writing, enabling projects, connecting one person to another. All these things, which of course are mostly hidden, they don't appear in books. But notice that he was doing this all the time, and at an ever higher pitch as his own career and profile rose.
Yeah, I think that stuff about not being a joiner is a feint. I think it was intentional misdirection, and there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in Edward. Really, a lot of that. More than I had assumed. So he was the organizer's organizer.
I'd like to go back to a question from Mark Quigley. Mark writes, how might we compare Said's ideas about an interest in Swift with his interest in Yeats, especially in Edward's contribution to the Field Day pamphlets? In particular, the notion of Tory anarchy in comparison to Yeats's alarm about the decline of the Anglo-Irish and the rise of a formerly colonized people, Yeats saw as unworthy or incapable of self-governance.
Wow. That might demand a greater knowledge of Yeats's political thinking that I possess. I mean, clearly, I mean, the statement that is the most clear on these kinds of points would be, you know, the part of Culture and Imperialism titled Yates and Decolonization, and it's a delicate balancing act, I think, that is involved in that he's involved in that essay, and I think that, you know, it's important, I think, to remember that when Edward wrote about Yates in that particular piece, he is attempting to recuperate a figure that he had earlier condemned as being a part of the imperialist project. I think that, you know, it's important to remember how he talks about Yates and, to a certain extent, Joyce in Orientalism, where he identifies this kind of modernist thinking that appeals to antiquarian notions of the primitive, that, you know, that kind of imagery is deployed, obviously, in literary modernism quite freely, with being a huge part of the problem. So I think that there's a critical edge at times to the way he talks about Irish writers that, in some respects, for reasons of utility, perhaps, or the occasion of what he wants to stress, are in important ways recuperated.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that I think that Declan brought Edward to Sligo in 1986, which is the year that Conor Cruise O'Brien, who of course had written about Yates's fascism, but Conor publishes an enormous potboiler called The Siege, which is this very uncritical history of Israel and of Zionism. So there are many battles being fought out there. Deborah Burke is asking us, what do we think, or what do you think Said would make of Netanyahu's utterance yesterday that Israel can seek to conquer them if the current project of deterrence doesn't work?
Well, I think that he would just simply point out that the entire onslaught against the Palestinian people, this latest one, was cynically launched by Netanyahu, most likely because of his election troubles. That when you send the Israeli military into a mosque on the holiest night of Ramadan and start killing people, you're not just involved in the kind of routine oppression that goes on in the occupied territories. You're provoking in order to get a response. And so, you know, when you decide at the same time to evict from their homes people who have lived in this section of East Jerusalem for as many generations as people can remember, and then, you know, cross your arms and say it's not really a political battle, it's a real estate dispute. I mean, these are not meant to be taken seriously. These are goading and egging on kinds of comments that are meant to create outrage in the opposite. So it's the supreme arrogance of an unpunished Israel that lies behind Netanyahu's claims. It is the pretended response to a situation that was, in fact, the deliberate policy intention all along. I mean, nobody who follows the Israeli-Palestine conflict at all closely would think anything but that Israel believes that all of that territory is theirs. Edward would always the occupied territories are just simply an Israel that's about to become formally recognized. It's not at all unclear that is what they attempt to do. And as Edward would always point out, Israel is the only nation state that refuses to, in fact, say what its boundaries are. So it isn't only the internal colonization, but it's the expansion involved. It's a colonial settler state that whose origins were European and that followed the game plan of European colonization everywhere. that despite the multicultural aspects of Judaism itself, or the formation and ongoing population growth from immigration into Israel, is nevertheless a European colonial settler state. And so I think that these would be the kinds of points that Edward would make, and probably a lot more brilliant ones that I can't think of right now. But she certainly would be emphasizing these aspects of things, that this was foreordained. It's exactly what was always intended.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think you're making the points very, very well. I think the other very simple point is that people at the moment have wanted to, liberal media or liberal commentators or politicians wants to make a distinction between the relative peace of the last number of years and the hostilities that are taking place at the moment. But in fact, I think these things have to be regarded in some ways as in part a continuum. House evictions take place all the time.
Right.
And this is the big uncles issue in full scale military activity.
Well, I think, can I just add just one small thing, and that is, I think that that maybe, I don't know how Edward would have handled this, but I think that maybe it's the time, to kind of up the ante a little bit, right? And say that when we recognize, when we internalize and think about the fact that these bombing runs on Gaza are not just the show of disproportionate force, right? But when sewage plants and water supplies and hospitals and media centers are the targets, that this is genocidal, and that this is not just a violation of international law or of human rights, but this is the kind of thing that should make Israel a pariah, that should in fact lead to sanctions. There should be, in other words, open calls, and I would hope if Edward were alive, he'd be making them and find a really clever way of doing so, of an airlift to Gaza, to bring in not only medical supplies and food or people to rebuild, but weapons. And that if Israel wants to get in the way of that, then there should be consequences, which is to say complete isolation, no business done with Israel at all. And the punishment of any country that does, just like is being done criminally against Venezuela today, and other places, like North Korea. So I think the upping of the ante is maybe called for, given the current situation, which is there are signs that there's greater possibilities than ever to be critical of Israel without necessarily the retaliation that have often silenced people.
That's just one last question, Tim, because we've been giving you a very hard workout now for a long time. But just on that point that you just made, you are more in places of mind. You are more, how to put it, you suggest that Said might have been more sympathetic to the BDS movement than I might have imagined that he might have been myself. Just wondering if you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit or reflect on that a little bit.
Well, it's, of course, it must remain a matter of speculation.
Yes.
The part of his career that would militate perhaps against that conclusion would be the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which, of course, was one of his greatest achievements and one that he particularly prized. And so I know that they've come fully into the sights of the BDS movement as being a violation of the principles of the BDS movement, including in Said's family. So many of his sisters were active, particularly Jean Said. No, not Jean Said. More than anything, Grace Said have been highly critical of that. However, Edward did in fact demonstrate at every point in his career a versatility and a suppleness and a willingness to change. I mean, the most radical change would, of course, been after Oslo. So the very two-state, solution that he had for so long supported, and the Arafat that, when it was very unpopular to do so, he humanized and presented to the public, became his opposites and his enemies. So I think that shows that Edward would as you would expect him to, respond to events. And I think that given where things have gone, that he would have been open to it. And that's not merely, that is to the principles and goals of the BDS movement. He might have been critical of it, of the way it's run or some of its statements publicly. He might have wanted to change what would and would not be included under the sanctions and the boycotts. So I think that because he was already, when alive, very, very eager to organize, and in fact did organize at Columbia efforts to disinvest from Israel, that this would have been another tool in the arsenal of making the case against Israel. That's what I maybe prefer to believe, but I think that he would have found a way to support it critically. What form that would have taken, I don't really know. But I think that, in other words, there's documentary reasons to think that this would have happened, even if there's some counter arguments against it.
I don't want to just find just one more question, but Joe has asked two questions here, both of which are extremely interesting, and you might like to pick up on both or one or other of them. Joe is asking if can we return to Said's relationship to Marxism via the Middle East as opposed to the academy? In that respect, what did you, Tim, learn about this in your research for the book, about, say, Edward's relationship to the PFLP? And then Joe asks a second, quite different question. Would you care to reflect on the reception of your book so far?
Yeah, okay. So the first one is Edward, for a long time, took as one of his primary aims the creation of an indigenous theory. So the Beginnings book, that project Beginnings that he wrote about, it covers many things and seems to be talking about things completely unrelated to what I'm about to say. But, really one of the things that's on his mind the most is somebody from the Levant like me condemned to always be speaking about European great thinkers? And am I always going to have to be the person who articulates what has already been said by Europeans? Is there such a thing as a theory that doesn't take its energies from that? And I think he was really, really interested throughout his life in creating that. And that's where his relationship to Marxism in the Middle East, I think, comes in. I think he considers it an imported ideology that is a little too easy for people there to have taken on. It doesn't reckon enough with the culture of Islam, for example, which even for those who, like himself, were not Muslims, is part of the general culture of the place. The particular linguistic relationship of Arabs to the language of Arabic, given the Quran. I mean, all of these kinds of issues are ones that, the Marxists that he knew in the Middle East really didn't have any access to, or any interesting way of dealing with or incorporating into their public address to the public. So what you got very often in Middle Eastern Marxists are the kinds of ideas that were prominent among those who attacked Orientalism so much, which is let's stop all of this attention to culture, which is idealistic, and let's get back to political economy, that kind of thing. And it was sort of anti-intellectual from his point of view. It would be impossible to be involved in Middle Eastern politics or in the Palestinian movement without being around communists of all sorts. It was, most of the leaders of the Communist Party are, like in Israel, they're all Palestinians. So I mean, it was like, it's not a fearful bogey the way that people in America would think about Marxism. It was more like a familiar friend that was perhaps not supple enough, not adaptive enough in order to really be politically effective. And so I think he just made a judgment that it wasn't going to, be the vanguard party that was necessary given the conditions. But as we all know, he was acting as an attorney for Marxist intellectuals in every way and was deeply, deeply opposed to anti-communism. He would never take that position publicly and hated people who did and mocked them in print. The thing I would also say about his relationship to Marxism in the Middle East is, yes, you're right. He was very close to the PFLP. And if he weren't one who strategically wanted to present himself as not a joiner, probably would have joined. He was that close to it. But which means the far left, the kind of Marxist left of the Palestinian movement. I think he was a much more radical thinker than he let on to many people. This is one of his masks. That's my way of thinking about it. Maybe again, I prefer him to be that way. I don't think so. I think there's lots of indications that he was. The close friendship with Sadiq al-Azam, a Syrian Marxist, in his formative years in Lebanon are, I think, a testament to that. Their problem was not so much, well, Marxism, let's not go that far. It's more, nobody is radical enough in the Palestinian movement. We need to make people, actually not just talk about revolution in coffee shops, but actually do something. That's the nature of all these letters he's writing back in his formative years as he's friends with this communist intellectual from Syria, Sadiq al-Azam. So the other thing I would say is that in his late Palestinian writings, the ones that we've already talked about, like in the end of the peace process and so on, his analysis of various Middle Eastern states and what's wrong with them is the most Marxist of all of his analyses. He is talking political economy. He's talking about class formations. He's talking about the insufficient organizational self-consciousness of the bourgeoisie, of this, those arguments. So it's sort of, he does have an ongoing relationship with Marxism in that way and to that degree. So I know that's maybe an inadequate answer, but there's many different dimensions that I think I've touched on that would be maybe signs of future investigation there. About the reception of the book, I mean, first of all, I'm surprised at how widely it's been reviewed. I'm very, very grateful and very happy about that. I when you take on a project like this, the first thing was, can I actually write a biography? And then secondly is, will they actually publish it? And that was a long process. So I was just happy that I got it taken by a commercial press. That was the first thing. Secondly, I hoped for a couple of prominent reviews, and then it's like it's being reviewed everywhere. Not always in the way one would like, but then again, there's lots of things to overcome. You're talking about a person that meant something to a lot of different people in different ways. And when you get into something that, when you try in a book to cover all of his aspects and really show him as an intellectual and take seriously that side of things, there's going to be a lot of people who are left behind or who wanted something else. They wanted more color, they wanted more sex, and so on. So there's been, some grumblings about that. But overall, I would say, even in the mainstream press, I've been very happy with what's been said. And, I've learned that a lot of reviewers in these major venues, like, the New Yorker or the LRB, I mean, they think that it's, they're doing you a favor by covering the book. And they then feel that it's okay for them to pass along everything that they've gotten from the book as though it's theirs, And that side of it has been a little dispiriting because they don't always make clear that they're getting all this stuff from my book, Right. So that part of it has been a little dispiriting. But for the most part, I think it's been very well received as far as my judgment is that it has been. And the places where I wanted to maybe have my say about what somebody got wrong or inaccurate have, except in one case, have printed my riposte, my response. But the last thing I'll say is, now that it's gone through the kind of Washington Post and Wall Street Journal kinds of venues, it's going to enter, I think, hopefully it will enter a different kind of phase, and there'll be more kind of intellectually serious but still widely accessible venues. So the most recent review is in the Boston Review, and I think it's the first one written by a Palestinian in English, and it's a very interesting, very informed review. So I'm happy to be part of the conversation, and it's really about Edward in the end, and so I think that this has created an interest in his work and a renewed interest in his work. Of course, it hasn't created the interest, but it's brought people back to him, and I'm very happy about that.
I think that's absolutely right, Tim. Joe is writing his thanks to you very full and generous answers and very eloquent responses. And I think
Thank you, Joe.
I would bear that out. You've given us enormously of both your intellectual effort and your time and your consideration over the last hour and 50 minutes, Tim. So we've had a very good workout, but we're very, very grateful for your time.
Well, Conor, I also wanted to say in the presence of some others that, you and I have been corresponding forever and have loved each other's work. And it's just so great to be meeting you in this way, in this kind of venue. I thank you very much for letting me be a part of it.
My wish, of course, was that we would have brought you in person to Maynooth somehow, but alas, for this year anyway, that can't happen. But maybe sometime in the future. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for coming along today and taking part. The discussion, or Tim's talk and the discussion, have been recorded, so these things will be made accessible by means that Tracy will explain to me at some point. And thank you all for coming along, and thank you very, very much to Timothy Brennan for a marvelous book and a marvelous talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.